Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, 100&Change, How Thinking Big Can Lead to Greater Investments and Greater Impact. My name is Terry Horton, and I'm the Project Director at NNCG. For the benefit of our guests, the National Network of Consultants to Grantmakers is a learning community of philanthropy consultants along with foundations and regional associations who have joined together to have a positive impact on the practice of philanthropy. And I invite you to join us and learn more at our website, nncg.org. Turning to a few housekeeping matters today, all of our attendees are in listen-only mode, and we encourage you and we welcome you to ask questions. Please submit them at any time using the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. Just type and send. Questions can be submitted at any time during the broadcast, and we'll try to get to them right away. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it will be available for viewing from NNCG. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Cecilia Conrad, Managing Director at the MacArthur Foundation. She leads the MacArthur Fellows Program, the MacArthur Awards for Creative and Effective Institutions, and 100&Change, which we're going to hear more about today. Before joining the foundation in January 2013, she had a distinguished career as both a professor and an administrator at Pomona College in Claremont, California, and she's taught at several other prestigious universities. Dr. Conrad received her PhD in economics from Stanford University, and we are thrilled to have her today. And with that, Cecilia, I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here to talk about 100&Change, a MacArthur initiative that will award a single grant of $100 million to a single project to solve a problem, take a big slice of a problem, or unlock the resources required to solve a problem. We issued this call in an agnostic way. We opened it to every field or domain or type of solution. We opened it to for-profit and nonprofit organizations, and we opened it to the world. So today what I'd like to do is to give you an update and status report on this project. I will also then talk a little bit about how we designed the selection process and some of the considerations we had, things we rejected. I will talk about what we've learned thus far, and then talk about some of the next steps and a bit about our curation plan. I am happy to take questions as we go along. I am working under the assumption that most of you have heard of 100&Change, but if there's anyone out there who needs more information about the project itself, please let me know. So in June of 2016, we launched the 100&Change competition. We engaged in an extensive marketing effort, and I'm happy to talk more about that as well, to get the word out all over the world. And we were a little bit worried because we really did want to open to applications everywhere. We were worried about whether we would hit different spots. But let me just share you a story. I was on a trip, a personal trip, a vacation. It's going to be a strange vacation because what I did was I visited 5 different universities in South Africa. And I was at one of them, and I was sitting next to the director for the vice president for research, and I said, oh, I've got to tell him about 100&Change. And so I introduced myself, and I said, I'm from the MacArthur Foundation. I have to tell you about 100&Change. And he said, oh, we know all about 100&Change. So I felt pretty good about our outreach effort at that point. We had 7,669 registrants on the site. Those included organizations who might have been interested in applying, but also media interest in members of the media and just individuals. And that ended up converting into 1,904 completed proposals submitted to 100&Change. I'd have to say that was more than I expected, but other people were surprised we didn't get 10,000. It was not a short application. It did require quite a bit of work and time investment on the part of the participants. It included a short video. They had to have memorandums of understandings with partners, audited financials. So it wasn't something you could just send a postcard in. One of the things we learned in that process is that everyone, not only not only college students, which I was used to from having been a professor, but everyone waits till the last minute to finish it. When a few days before the deadline, we thought we might get 400 proposals. And then in that last day, we started to see the numbers rack up. So currently, after we received the 1,904 completed proposals, we went through a process of administrative review with MacArthur staff to see if the proposals met our basic requirements, had dotted their I's and crossed their T's, and whether they had rigorous evidence that they could be effective and other things that we were looking at. And we narrowed that group down to 801 valid proposals. Those 801 proposals were then sent out to our evaluation panel, which I'll say a little bit more later. Our board met in December of 2016 and narrowed the pool down to 8 semifinalists. And we've been working with those 8 semifinalists over the past 6 months. And on September 19th, we will narrow that down to up to 5 finalists. So that's where we are now in the process. So this has been a little bit of a wild ride for us because this is brand new. So let me just say a little bit about why we decided to do this, the genesis of 100&Change. At the foundation, like many others, we were undergoing some self-questioning about the way we've been doing our work, and began to revise from a kind of model where work was organized geographically, where there were many smallish programs, not terribly small, but smallish in a lot of different areas, to narrow our focus to what we've called big bets and enduring commitments. And in doing that, we made the decisions about what were the big bet areas we were going to focus on, which happened to be nuclear security, criminal justice. We have a place-based big bet in Nigeria, and then we have a climate solutions, which is focused on U.S. leadership in climate change. And then we had our enduring commitments, our long-term commitment to the city of Chicago, where we're based, and then also a commitment to, broadly speaking, to American democracy, but we're particularly been focused on journalism and media. But the fact is, we picked those things internally. And our president, Julia Stash, posed the question of, given that we're narrowing our focus, and given the critique sometimes of philanthropy that we are too insular and not especially transparent, that it might be good to have a space where we could be open about what problem we would work on and how we would work on it. And it was that idea that she brought back to us. How can we be open? How can we think about a space where the concept of a big bet, a focused amount of significant amount of resources might help us make serious headway on a problem, but let's get help on defining what that problem might be and what the solution might be. So that was the idea that led to us, and she came back to our team and said, okay, here's what we want to do, how are we going to do it? So we internally had investigated a lot of possibilities. One possibility might have been a kind of grand challenge, like the grand challenge kind of programs that Gates do, where you define a problem and you say, tell us what we need to know in order to be able to solve it. And we wanted to actually focus more on the solution and less on the problem itself. So we sort of moved away a little bit from the grand challenge. We thought about a traditional prize where you say, here's a problem to solve it, and then we'll award you some money because you've achieved that solution. But there we were concerned about putting the burden of risk-taking on the participants in the competition, because the prize only sort of rewards the winner. And we thought about, putting out a traditional kind of RFP, but that didn't necessarily allow for the kind of openness that we were imagining. So we emerged gradually with this idea of bundling the problem and the solution and putting out a single call for those two things as a bundle, and making it then possible to be as open as we want it to be. Now, what that also meant, though, that it would be a challenge is to evaluate proposals, because we would be comparing potentially apples and oranges, and you can see that if you look at our semifinalists. And so we thought about how are we going to go to evaluate this. We can't put together sort of the kind of traditional evaluator panel that you might find at the NIH, National Institutes for Health, or at the NSF. So what we did was we convened a panel of, I think of them as the wise heads, a panel of thinkers, visionaries, and experts who could help advise us by looking at these and evaluating them according to a set of agnostic criteria. And our agnostic criteria were that we wanted projects that were meaningful, meaning that we were looking for a problem that is bold, potentially audacious, that we want to try and solve it, where the proposed solution was actually going to have a big impact on specific populations or on the planet overall. We asked them to evaluate the projects in terms of being verifiable. And what we mean by verifiable is that we were looking for convincing, persuasive evidence that the solution would work. So here's a case where we made a conscious decision that we were not looking for innovation. And I think one of the things that we've learned internally is that committing to a $100 million grant is risky in and of itself. So we were trying to mitigate other sources of risk in this process. And so we were not looking to speculate on new inventions or innovations. We were looking for something that was proven. The idea being that there might be solutions that people have tested that are sitting on the shelf but may need support for scaling up. Feasible was our third criteria. We were looking to see if the solution could actually be done. Did the team have the capacity to do it? What were the potential obstacles out there in terms of political obstacles, social obstacles to the project actually being implemented? And then finally, we wanted the solution to be durable. Does the team propose a solution that has staying power? Do they have a plan for how this solution will last and continue to have its impact long after our $100 million would be spent? And when we thought about durability, there are a variety of ways we thought it might be achieved. One is that there could be a problem out there that $100 million solves, and once it's solved, it's done, it's finished, it's not going to come back. Probably the closest to that right now among our semifinalists would be the Carter Center project, where the proposal is to eradicate river blindness in Nigeria. And if this all goes according to plan with our $100 million, there will be no need for additional expenditures on this particular problem. It will be done. The second possibility is that with $100 million, you could set the project up in such a way that there is an identifiable revenue stream. It might come from the public sector. It might come from sort of other future philanthropic efforts. It might come from the market, but that identifiable revenue stream would cover the ongoing costs of sustaining the solution. And then the third possibility is really kind of that unlocking resources, that the project would unlock resources that would continue to sustain the problem over the long term. Here, let me give examples of the last two. For unlocking the resources, the concept behind the Catholic Relief Services project, which is hoping to transform the way we care for children who are parentless or whose parents can't care for them, to rely more on family-based care and less on orphanages. And their theory is that there currently is enough philanthropic money flowing to orphanages that if we could educate people and create the kind of alternative system that's family-based, that we could redirect those dollars. So there's where you might unlock resources. And in the second case of an identifiable revenue stream, I think if you look at the Himalayan Cataract Project, this is a project that is performing a very low-cost cataract surgery in various parts of developing and emerging economies, and that the economies of scale can be realized once you've got the infrastructure in place to make the provision of this cataract surgery something that you could charge a fairly low price for, and the market would sustain it. I'm going to pause there and ask if there are questions about that criteria. Our idea is that these criteria would be applicable to any kind of problem-solution combination.
Cecilia, I think we're doing great so far. This sounds
okay.
Wonderful, and I appreciate the fact that you clarified the big bet that's verifiable versus the big bet that is addressing a complex challenge without a known solution. So thank you. This is great.
Okay. So I want to give you a sense of how the projects did when they were scored across this, because I think there are some lessons learned in this particular aspect. So I've put up a graphic now that shows you the median scores and that were given by the judges. These are median normalized scores. We paid particular attention to the projects were randomly assigned to our judges, and we didn't want projects to be hampered or hindered because they were randomly assigned to a hard versus easy judge. So there was a normalization procedure that belongs to Common Pool, our firm that we worked with in designing the competition and also in the management of the competition, that was applied to the judges' scores to address that issue. So these are normalized median scores. And the first thing you'll see is that, and I've broken them up by quartiles in terms of how they were ranked by the judges. I'm going to focus for a moment just on the first quartile, which is the top 200 proposals. And you'll see that they did very, very well on the meaningful in comparison to the lower quartiles, where that's one of the places where those projects got lower scores. One of the things we kind of learned there that we're thinking a lot about is that there did seem to be a little bit of, I'm going to use the word bias, but I don't necessarily mean it in a negative way, on the part of the judges. They preferred projects that were global to projects that were local. They preferred projects that were outside of the U.S., particularly focused on low resource settings, than to projects that were inside of the U.S. And there seemed to be a certain appeal of projects in health and medicine, regardless of whether those were really research projects or actually solutions. And so we've been spending a little bit of time of thinking about how do you give instructions to judges to perhaps even out the playing field a little bit, particularly for some of the more locally focused projects. And one of the conversations we're having is whether you need to separate out something very local from the international and global in scope. On verifiable, you'll see that the scores, again, are pretty good for the top 200. And one of the big distinguishing factors there is in whether or not organizations understood what we mean by persuasive evidence. We got everything from citations to randomized controlled studies to statements that all of my friends tell me that it's a good idea. Feasible, there again you'll see a range, and I'd say here quite a bit of it had to do with the team capacity. We found that there were many teams that formed in response to 100&Change, and that was very exciting. We've heard from stories from many participants about how the competition made them focus on the notion of actually solving a problem as opposed to just kind of treating it over the long term. At some of the universities, there were internal competitions for submission to 100&Change, and that those competitions led to people talking to each other who, from the engineering school and the School of Education, where they found they had similar interests, and they've put together projects in that context. We know that there are cities regional areas where regional coalitions were formed to address issues such as racial inequality. And so it was all an exciting kind of spurring of activity around this issue. But if you think about it, we announced in June 2016, and our application deadline was October 2016. So that was not a lot of time to really build a team and to build capacity and to be able to make a persuasive case that you were ready for a $100 million grant. So I think, you know, one of the things we learned there is that we want to kind of give people a longer launch pad, and they'll know now that we're going to do this again in 3 years, and that we also are giving quite a bit of thought to what kinds of capacity building activities, not only for individual organizations, but also for teams and partnerships. How do you build capacity among teams and partnerships so that they could be prepared to really be competitive in this competition? And then durable is where they had their lowest scores. Sorry, jumped ahead a little bit. Overall. And this one is interesting because I think the concept of really thinking carefully about how you would sustain a solution beyond the $100 million grant seemed to be, in some cases, last on the list for many of the applicants. My favorite answer to the durable was an application, because I think it was the most honest. It just said, we will pray. We saw applications that were really dependent on continued philanthropic support. We saw some that hadn't completely thought through the business plan. And then at the other extreme, we had a significant number of applications submitted that were really looking for investments, for impact investments. And 100&Change was a grant program, and so they didn't necessarily meet our requirements in terms of being for a charitable purpose and not having more than incidental private benefit. Those impact investment projects we actually handed over to our internal impact investment team to look at and to think about, and we're happy to share that with other organizations that are interested in what kinds of proposals that are out there that might be suitable for impact investments. So it's an overview of how well the projects did overall. I have put up a graphic here that gives you a sense of the top 200 applications and the distribution of the projects across the globe. And this is available on our competition website. We have a public searchable database of all of the proposals, nearly all 1,900, with the exception of a few that asked not to be included. And then we have some information about the top 200, and you can go and explore that. And this brings me to another kind of almost instant lesson that emerged from 100&Change. And that is that not long after we announced, I started getting phone calls from others who said, you know, we're really kind of surprised you're doing such a wide open call, because it's always been a little scary to think about what you might get with a wide open call. And at the time, I was kind of probably naive, so it wasn't until 1,904 applications showed up that I started to think about what it meant to be a little scary. But they asked if we would be willing to share. And what we recognized is that this is a huge database of ideas about how to solve problems. And there are ideas about problems in all kinds of domains and spheres in all different parts of the world. And one of the challenges that we are now confronting is how to organize this information. We're committed to sharing it, but how to organize it in ways that will actually be valuable and useful to the field at large. And if anyone on the call has particular questions or comments about that, I welcome it. We are working with several partners. We have a partnership going with the Foundation Center, which I think there's someone from the Foundation Center on the call that is helping us to organize the data, and there'll be more about that in the future. We are working with the Center for High Impact Philanthropy at UPenn that will be looking at doing a special supplement of their giving guide that's focused on the 100&Change proposals. Charity Navigator had found that of the top 200, they had rated already about 40 organizations. And so they did some profiling of them on their site. So we're interested in different ways to disseminate and get this information out to people effectively and, quite honestly, in a less labor-intensive way than we were initially doing it, which was that one of us would go through the 1,900 proposals and respond to specific requests. So the curation part of this became a much bigger and ongoing piece of the project than we initially imagined. So we took the high-scoring proposals to our board, and we sort of had them focused on the highest scoring. They had access to the full database. They were so engaged in this that many of them really went through the database to look at all of the projects and to think about them. And the board deliberated in a meeting, and then for almost a month later, in various forms of electronic communication, to arrive at the final 8 semifinalists. And those 8 semifinalists, I think many of you on the call are probably familiar with them, but I'll just name them off. In the upper right-hand corner, I have the Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee's collaboration to launch an early childhood development program in the refugee camps for Syrian arena refugees. Next to that is the Human Diagnosis Project, now renamed the Alliance for the Underserved, which is going to combine kind of crowdsourcing and artificial intelligence to provide access to specialist care to people who get their health care through our nation's safety net. To the right of that is the Internet Archive Project. This is an attempt to digitize a large number of books that are held right now in physical copies in public libraries across the U.S. and to essentially create a kind of national, and in fact Canada would be involved too, so international public library that would be accessible to anyone with a library card. And it's based on the notion that you can loan one copy at a time under the current copyright laws. The next one row, we have Harvest Plus. Harvest Plus is introducing biofortified foods in different parts of the world, but this particular project focuses on Africa to address micronutrient deficiencies. These are deficiencies in iron, in zinc, in vitamin A that are associated with health ailments such as night blindness, anemia, various gastrointestinal diseases. And the project would help to launch crops across an expanded array of countries. I believe it's 17 right now that they're looking at, compared to what they are currently engaged in. To the right of that is the Rice University project. This is a project that actually is an international collaboration with hospitals and research organizations in Malawi, and they're adding on Tanzania and Nigeria. It's to adapt technologies that are used to help low birth weight newborns to survive. And they have already adapted, you'll see a picture there, of Punami, which is a breathing machine that's been adapted for a setting where electricity can go on and off and where there isn't the kind of climate control that the fancy equipment we use in the US is usually expecting. And this work is being done by engineering students both in the US and in Malawi. So there's a kind of innovator development component of it. On the bottom row, we have the Himalayan Cataract Project. I've mentioned that before. That's the cataract surgeries. In the middle is the Catholic Relief Services with Lumos and Maestro, which is focused on moving us away from institutional to family-based care for parentless children. And then to the right of that is the Carter Center's project to eradicate river blindness in Nigeria. And I'm assuming that most of you have already probably seen some of the videos, but if you haven't, please go and take a look at those. So where we are now in this project is that these 8 semifinalists, we have been doing an intensive kind of deep dive with, and it's really got 2 parts. One is that we have been providing technical assistance to the teams. We've been working with MSI, who has worked with the foundation in the past on issues of how do you scale up. And they have asked, they started out by having each team do kind of a self-assessment, a scalability assessment, and then have been a kind of sounding board and a source of advice for those teams to scale. And was there something where you do have a question, Terry?
Oh, I'm sorry. There is a question, but keep going. I'll ask in a minute.
Okay. And so each one of the teams has spent the past 6 months looking hard at so if you think about it, all of them have problem solutions that they've shown have worked in a particular context. So scaling here could mean that they're trying to go bigger where they are. It could be that they are trying to add multiple countries where they've worked in one country and they want to take it to some others. Several of the projects fit in that category. And it could be that they want to add partners, and what they've done is spent a lot of time working on that over the past 6 months. And what we found is that's been incredibly valuable. They submitted revised proposals a month ago, and those revised proposals are much more detailed in what I might call the engineering plan. How do you get from A, this solution that you've implemented in one place, to B, expansion of the solution to more locations or to more numbers of people. And so I'll pause there and let me take the question.
Okay, we've got 2 questions. One goes back to our prior conversation, so it's a little bit out of order, but the question is about your experience as a foundation and your outreach, the volume, the quality of responses. What would you do next time just to handle that volume and quantity?
Okay. Yes. So, first of all, I was pleased that out of the 1,904 applications that were submitted that were completed through the process, there were probably less than 20 that were, I'm trying to put this gently, a little crazy. I was actually a little disappointed because I wanted more stories to tell about wild ideas. I was impressed by the seriousness of the proposals we received. And I think it was because, as I mentioned, we had a long conversation about whether to have a really short application and then, rely a lot on screening initial ideas, or to have a somewhat longer application. I think we feel that we might have hit the right spot in terms of the longer application, which was roughly about 30 pages, and we're in the process of getting estimates of how long it took people to complete it. But I'm guessing, I think we're between 6 and 10 hours of completion time to actually just get all the paperwork organized. However, we were concerned about the high number who were weeded out through the administrative review process. And one of the things we're going to try and do the next time we do this is develop a kind of self-assessment checklist tool, because what we found is that many of them did not understand fully, or we did not think really about the private benefit issue. So we had a large number of the for-profit submissions ended up being ruled out in the administrative review because they didn't really understand the charitable purpose, private benefit kind of balancing act that they needed to do. So for example, we would get an application that would say, our invention is going to be so great for the climate that no profit we earn could be larger than the benefit to the planet. And that doesn't really get at the private benefit kind of issue that we, when we're making a grant, need to confront. The other kind of category of applications were applications where it really was, even though we said this wasn't open to individuals, we had people who formed LLCs and said it's an LLC, not an individual. We had examples of people of projects that really had no evidence, none at all. And so what we want to do is to develop a kind of checklist to get people to perhaps self-screen before they really dive into doing the full application process. And we're hoping that that will reduce the numbers who are disappointed by not getting through the administrative review. So that's one of the things. Yeah.
And I've got, if I interrupted, please keep going, but I'll throw in my other two questions here. One is,
go ahead and throw them in.
On the scalability assessment, when you're really doing a deep dive, is there financial support for the 8 sub-finalists to help with this process? Do you do the balancing act of whether you're creating a burden just to apply at this point, or is the prize at the end so big that this is well worth it for the organizations? And then the other question that I'll interject here is just, you've already mentioned MSI and Common Pool and the Foundation Center. If you, either now or later, if you could just speak to the role of consultants and how you picked them, and it sounds like they might have already had relationships. So financial support for finalists and consultants.
Yes. Okay. So I will. Let me talk about the financial support, because we had when we launched this, we had a vigorous internal discussion about whether there should be grants to the semifinalists. And I think we found the idea attractive, but also kind of there were a lot of practical and pragmatic barriers given the time frame we had defined for ourselves to actually do a grant to each one of the semifinalists. I mean, it's just the idea of once you pick and then the whole process. It's something we haven't taken off the table. But what we decided instead was to basically provide these supports. So that we hoped would give enough value to the semifinalists that they would find it worthwhile. And that's one of the things we're going to be assessing as we look at this. So we provided the technical support at MSI. They all got sort of a big chunk of time available from MSI to work on these questions. We provided support from our communications team in making new videos for the 8 semifinalists. They have provided support in terms of communications outreach, making connections, and also in terms of just sort of general advice. So we've tried to provide in-kind service to do this. Our other theory is that the work that they would be doing in terms of developing real scalability, real plans for scalability, would have a benefit beyond the 100&Change competition. And part of that burden is our burden, in that we think that there's some great projects here, and we want to find other philanthropists who might be interested in supporting it. So much of our curation effort is also kind of a promotion to, we've been talking with donor intermediaries, with other funders, with high net worth individuals who might have an interest in some of these projects. And we've had a few successes early on, and we're excited about that and hope to have some more. So the idea is that they're going to walk away with something that's of high value that we help to support the creation of.
That's great. Thank you.
And then there is one more. I mean, so the 8 semifinalists, even after we've picked the finalists, we have one more workshop planned for them that is really a kind of messaging workshop of how to be big bettable, how to approach these kinds of high net worth individuals, and so on. And then we have a finalist event that will be in December where we're inviting other funders. And we will be able to say to those other funders, because in addition to this kind of work with MSI on scaling and developing more robust plans, we've also been engaged over the past 6 months in really getting to know these projects. We've made site visits where site visits seemed relevant and appropriate. We have gotten technical reviews where there's a kind of highly technical aspect of the project. We've also pushed them a bit on what we have called authentic engagement in communities of interest. And here is we're reflecting on a little bit of what our takeaways have been from other attempts to do kind of really big interventions into a specific problem area. And that is that sometimes a mistake can be, the mistake is that there's not enough engagement with either the targeted beneficiaries or with those who are the policymakers who need to be engaged to actually sustain something over the long term. Or we also asked that they engage, that they try to identify who might stand to lose from this intervention. So, for example, with the Catholic Relief Services, have you actually been in conversation with the staff of orphanages where you're trying to shift from institutional care to more family-based care? Have you been in, and each one of them had their own sort of effort to define who those groups are. And that was also what they've been doing over the past 6 months. And it's varied a lot across the projects. But what we've done is ask them to really deeply engage. And so I've just shown some illustrations here. The Harvest Plus had a lot of community meetings with farmers. Now this is something because promotion is really integral to the Harvest Plus project, because you can biofortified seeds, then you have to convince farmers to plant them, and then you have to convince people to eat them. And sometimes the biofortification can change the look and feel of a crop. So they have extensive kinds of marketing and so on, but there's nothing really to substitute for the on-the-ground community engagement. And so we have sign-in sheets from meetings with farmers all across the continent of Africa. We have also hosted a social media engagement using Reddit AMA, in which there were participants from various potential communities who might be impacted by it. In the case of Catholic Relief Services, which is on the right, they actually developed kind of a template for recording their interactions. And in addition to talking to people at orphanages, they also talked to what they called care leavers, and people who grew up in institutions and are now graduated from them. And that network has now become an important part of this initiative. Another example of partnerships forming is the Human DX, which I mentioned when they first applied to us, the Human Diagnostics Project. It was just this project. They now have brought in a lot of partners to form what they've called the Alliance for the Underserved, and that happened through this process of engagement. There's a similar example from the Internet Archive Project, which I really kind of enjoy, because when we made this database available, we were hoping that some of the participants in 100&Change would use it to find other organizations, potential partners who were doing similar kinds of work. And the Internet Archive Project has evolved now to, in fact, include several other organizations who had applied independently to 100&Change. And I think, you know, it's a much stronger project to have that network involved. And then in some cases, as I mentioned, it involved making sure that they were making connections with the right policymakers, the right politicians, the right people inside of ministries and outside of ministries. And so we've collected a huge volume of letters of support. We actually have over 1 gigabyte of materials that we received from the 8 semifinalists. So one of those kind of lessons learned is that we hadn't thought about how we were actually going to deliver all of those materials to our board, and that's been a bit of a challenge too. But in addition to the community engagement, we also asked them to think about inclusion. And this is something I think in retrospect I would have put more into the front end of our process than until the end. We worked with 2 organizations who think a lot about the inclusion of persons with disabilities, and they provided feedback on the individual proposals and also a checklist. So the 2 organizations were Access Living, which is based here in Chicago, and MSI US, I'm sorry, I'm getting my twos, not management, Mobility International USA, MIUSA, which is based out in California. And they also gave them a checklist to go through and sort of ask themselves some questions about this. I think it was a useful exercise for our teams to really seriously interrogate what they were doing in this regard. And I think something I would put in on a little bit earlier in our process, because I think it would be valuable for some of the other participants in 100&Change as well. We've asked them to talk about gender equity and how are they going to track data so that we'll know that their projects are also inclusive of women and of any marginalized populations in the areas where they're working. And so all of that material has come in to our board. I'm gonna take a little sip, and then I want to talk just a bit more about what we've learned internally through this process. But if there are any questions, it's a good moment.
You're doing great, thank you.
Okay. So I think there have been some exciting things internally, and I'm going to get back to this question about consultants. So as I mentioned, when Julia Stash came back to our team, we didn't have a team then, when she came back to some of the senior staff here at the foundation and said, we've got this, we want to do this, how do we do it? How do we have something that's really wide open? We sought out people who were excited about participating in the design of the project, regardless of where they resided in the current structure of the foundation. So we ended up pulling together I think of it as a cross-disciplinary team. We had people who were from our international programs, we had people from the U.S. programs, we had people who were from our special initiatives in the arts, we had people who were not in any existing programs, but some from one of the more functional departments. And that effort turned out to be a really productive way of generating creative thinking and ideas. And that's sort of, I think that model is one that we are now using in other contexts. And we want to think about how to do something new, something we haven't done before. It's very helpful to pull people from multiple places who can come in with, well, here's some analogies we might draw. And one of our MacArthur fellows, Howard Gardner, has talked about what's called fruitful asynchrony. And I think that's partly what came across from those different kinds of teams. We then decided, once we decided we kind of wanted to go to the competition route, we started interviewing various people who had done competitions, who had done challenges, grand challenges. We've actually had an ongoing conversation with the Grand Challenges group at Gates, and even had a program officer exchange with Gates to help increase our learning there. And then we, using those references, went out and talked to many different prize and competition consultants. One of the things that led us to our work with Common Pool is, I'll say, almost every one of those consultants, including Common Pool, thought that this was an insane idea. That they thought that we had to define, we just could not do this as wide open as we were saying. Common Pool sort of felt once they had done their responsible thing of telling us we were crazy, that they were willing to go along and to help us invent this new kind of thing. So that was the sort of first step. This has been a kind of design build process, and we have continued with this interdisciplinary team, and then have identified needs as we've gone along. As soon as we decided we were going to focus on tested solutions, we knew we were going to need some help on scaling. And as you've noted, we already had a past history as a foundation in supporting some of the work that MSI has done on scaling, and so that seemed a natural partnership. As we are continuing to identify needs, we are out scouting for who might be able to help us to provide that support. I think as we look forward to the next round, we're going to be thinking a lot about that capacity building issue that I brought up earlier. We ideally want to see more of these kinds of organizations that were sparked, or collaborations that were sparked by 100&Change, become more competitive when we launch again. And so we're thinking a lot about different types of capacity building. Is it leadership? Is it how do you build a partnership? Is it really thinking, is it some of the testing that needs to be done, the pilot testing of projects? So all of those things are on the table. We also have another partnership, which is a evaluation and assessment. We have a learning partner. We're working with APT as our learning partner, and they've come on board just the past 6 months and are interviewing and collecting data and beginning to get some lessons that we are going to be learning from as we design the competition again. Now, internally, what we've also learned is that even though we were excited about doing something completely new and different and taking this kind of bold idea in this stance where people said maybe you were crazy, there's still a kind of fundamental level of risk aversion within any organization. And we've constantly had to challenge ourselves to overcome that risk aversion. But as I've mentioned earlier, we've tried to build a lot of safeguards into this to mitigate some of those risks. We have asked each team to define really specific milestones, and those milestones are going to be used to help decide whether funding continues. So there really will be a kind of robustness built in to the year-to-year renewals of the grant that might perhaps more robust and more rigorous than we might have done with smaller amounts of money. I mentioned earlier about the health and medicine kind of bias in how things were scored. So we're thinking a lot about that field, which is not a field for MacArthur, and how comfortable we are with potentially funding in that space. And that, I think, is the other challenge, is that it's foundations, and I'll speak here just about MacArthur. I'm fairly new to the philanthropy world, but there is there's a pattern of going to who you know, like a pattern of your network of contacts and relationships and building those over time. And here we are asking that we develop relationships kind of on a fast track, that we are part of the whole idea behind 100&Change was to reach beyond our normal networks. And so that's one of the reasons for, I think, building in a lot of safeguards and engaging in quite a bit of getting to know you over the past 6 months. I now feel like all of these teams are teams that we have some deep knowledge and understanding of. Any more questions coming in?
Well, when you're ready for it, I think there's a question about, what's the miniature version of the big bet for, for example, a $200 million community foundation or a $60 million family foundation. How do you scale this fabulous idea down to right size it for smaller foundations or smaller communities? And you can do that now or in a minute.
Oh no, I'd love to do that now, because I think I'm going to go back now to the larger group, the 1904 and the 800, or at least the 801. And I think there are some opportunities out there for smaller versions of 100&Change. I referred earlier to our concern about some of the local-based proposals, and I think, in some cases, these are proposals that might benefit from smaller amounts of funding. So you could think about launching something, the $1 million, 1 million and change, 5 million and change. We've actually had a conversation. Someone suggested to me the idea of trying to get a coordinated effort among regional foundations, and to do something like 50 million for 50 states, or some version of that. And because what we saw is that we got these applications from everywhere. I'm just going to go back to that top 200 map. You can see how crowded it is. You can't quite see all of the U.S. in there, but there are some good ideas that people have out there. There are coalitions that get excited when you put out an open call like this and you do it as a competition, and you pay a lot of attention to generating excitement. I mean, we've consciously recognized that the media effort, that the outreach effort was an integral part of this project, both to generate the good ideas, but also to excite people to think about solving problems. Early on in this process, I had a conversation with some teenagers and high school students, and I mentioned to them that we were thinking about doing this, and I asked them, what would you do if you had 100 million? And the two of them got into the spirited debate about whether or not, one of them had an idea about, well, she would feed all the hungry children. And the other one said, but then you fed them, then what, after the 100 million's gone? And it was so exciting to watch the two of them really grapple with the kinds of issues that those of us in the philanthropic sector have to grapple with. So I think there are opportunities to generate community coalitions and that you may not have expected would come together through an open call like this. So I think there's some real possibilities with smaller numbers and different kinds of expectations about the numbers of people you might reach, or even smaller numbers where you may be willing to bet a little more on the untested innovation in order to give it a chance to be tested, so that perhaps it might be eligible for something like 100&Change when we do it again in the future.
Thank you. That's great. Cecilia, we've got about 4 minutes, and you know, I'd welcome any last comments.
I'm going to go to my last slide to make sure I don't miss this. I mentioned our finalist event. As I said, part of the purpose of this project is not only to identify a grantee for our $100 million, but really to kind of excite people to think about these, think about solving problems. That there are problems out there that, you know, that many times we're very interested in funding the new thing, and then it's funded, and then what happens? And so we really want to generate some excitement around problem solving. So the December event is December 11th. There will be an in-person event here in Chicago. There will also be a live streamed event that will have much of the event that's the in-person event, but also some special features just for the online audience. And if any of you are interested in this, please just send me an email to cconrad@macfound.org, and I'll make sure that you get additional information about it. The finalists will present their projects. There'll be an opportunity for small group conversations and question and answers with those finalists, and we are hopeful that we can generate some interest and support in the projects beyond the one that ultimately our board chooses for our $100 million grant.
Cecilia, this is thrilling. Thank you so much. I think the idea that you're really leveraging this project to connect amazing ideas and amazing projects to other foundations and other funders is really powerful. And I know that those of us who are consultants on the call can really take to heart the idea that just creating the space for pushing for bigger thinking about the possibility of problem solving is just really galvanizing and exciting. So thank you so much for your time. This has been fabulous.
Well, thank you. And as I said, if anyone has questions or would like to get some more information about the December 11th event, feel free to send me an email.
Wonderful. Again, this is NNCG with our fabulous presentation by Dr. Cecilia Conrad on 100&Change, and we are all eagerly looking forward to the release of the finalists. And congratulations to MacArthur Foundation. And with that, I'm going to sign us off. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.